Wilma was not into that. She didn't want to use the state to try to suppress communists in the U.S. She just wanted to show people that capitalism, for lack of a better term, free market enterprise, economic freedom, as you so wonderfully put it, is great and is the thing. So we should focus on that. And then people will see for themselves that it's better to have a smaller slice of a much bigger capitalist pie than an equal slice of a pathetic little communist pie.
On this episode of Liberty Curious, I sat down with Robert Wright, historian and senior research faculty at AIER, to discuss his new book, Fearless: Wilma Soss and America's Forgotten Investor Movement. Robert shares details of her remarkable story as a self-made woman, journalist, PR whiz, and activist who devoted her life to reforming corporate America. A staunch supporter of free markets and economic freedom, Wilma Soss believed that the private sector was the best means to achieve personal wealth, well-being, and liberty, and the ultimate defense against collectivism. If you enjoy this podcast, make sure to check out AIER's new YouTube channel here. So I'm really excited to talk about your new book, which is Fearless: Wilma Soss and the Forgotten Investors Movement. This is fabulous. So as I was telling you off camera, I was up into the wee hours reading this until I actually had to sleep. And so I'm about halfway through the book and I really got wrapped up in it. It's a great story and you're a great storyteller. And I found it very inspirational. So I think that maybe she's somebody that our audience might not know about, but I think that they will find inspiration in her story. So without giving away all of the details of your book, can you maybe give us kind of a broad overview of Wilma Soss and who she is?
Absolutely. So she is born in 1900 in San Francisco, California. And later on, she would say that the day she was born, the earth shook, which makes sense for California. But we went back and we looked not just on her birth date, but at times around, a couple days before and a couple days after. And there was no unusual seismic activity in San Francisco at that time. But there was, interestingly enough, a bubonic plague epidemic in San Francisco when she was born. And she came from what I've several times called a broken family, and I usually get slapped for that because that's one of the things we're not supposed to say anymore. But there was no father in her life. Some sources say that her father died. Other sources say that her mother got a divorce and used the dying as cover because back in the early 20th century, divorce was still pretty uncommon. There were a couple of states like South Dakota that were known as divorce mills, where women would go and they'd have to spend like 6 weeks, and then they could hire an attorney to get a divorce via South Dakota. One of the strange parts of the U.S. federal system is you can have these states that are have laws that run contrary to the rest of the country, and they can actually use it as a revenue source. So it's possible that her mom went to South Dakota and got a divorce, or maybe her father died in this bubonic plague or what have you. But we do know that she spent most of her childhood with her maternal grandparents in Brooklyn, New York. So she was not in San Francisco when the big quake hit. She was in New York, but we also know that her mom for a long time lived in the Bay Area, and that she would go back to see her mother. And of course, at that time, there were only two ways to do that. One was via steamship, and the other was via trains. And we think it was via trains because she had such a love affair for trains later on in her life. So she's living in Brooklyn with her maternal grandparents. And she said once that she was born Republican. Not that she became a Republican, that she was born Republican. And then I found out who her grandfather was, and I know exactly why she said that, because he worked for a life insurance company called Germania, now called Guardian Life Insurance Company of America, that I happened to write a 400-page book about back in 2005. And so I knew that this company was formed by people who escaped from political persecution in Germany after the 1848 revolutions there that were put down. So they come to America, and almost to a man, they become Republicans, because the Republican Party is just forming in the United States in the 1850s, and it's staunchly anti-slavery. And all of these German Protestants, emigres from Germany and from the religious and political strife there, were very much anti-slavery. So they all become Republicans. So and stay Republican. So I'm sure that her maternal grandfather, working at Germania / Guardian Life Insurance Company of America, was a solid Republican. Of the old Lincolnian type Republican, not the more modern type. But Wilma lives until 1986, so there was certainly an evolution of the Republican Party over that time, but she remains loyal to it, with the Watergate exception, when, like many Americans, she was like, "No, this tricky Dick Nixon guy's gotta go. He's just causing too much much trouble." But so Wilma grows. She graduates from high school in Brooklyn, from one of the public schools, and then she goes to college and she flunks out. But she doesn't. It was some business school that she never named. But she doesn't give up. She goes to the Columbia School of Journalism and gets an undergraduate degree there, and meets her husband, Joseph Soss, takes his name. So throughout most of her life, she was known as Wilma Soss, S-O-S-S. Soss rhymes with boss. People who didn't like her later on called her Applesauce or Mrs. Applesauce. We have recordings of her saying her own name. So we know absolutely that it's pronounced sauce, not sauce or anything like that. Sauce, just like tomato sauce. Yeah. So she marries this fellow, and they have a lifelong love affair. And he predeceases her. They never had any children, which is, and we don't know why, but this is really key to the to her story, because she becomes a journalist working at one of these Brooklyn newspapers. They used to be a dime a dozen. That's like blogs today. Everybody owned a paper. So she's working at one of these little things for like $7 a week. And she writes an article about an actress. And her husband sees the article and is like, this woman who wrote this has talent. So he introduced her to the Ziegfeld clan, of the Ziegfeld Follies fame. And they introduce her to this guy named Reichenbach, who was one of the leading sort of developers of the public relations field in the 1920s. So Wilma graduates in 1925 from Columbia. By 1930, she's working for this Reichenbach guy who, nicely for Wilma, passes away. And so she doesn't live in this giant's shadow for very long. She's there. She learns the skills. She is part of his network. So when he passes away, she's got all of these connections and people who want work done. So she builds a very successful public relations consultancy during the Great Depression as a married woman. She makes more money than her husband Joe, and more money than most men in the country. She's running her own business. She had men working for her and reporting to her. and many, many success stories. Have you heard of Gladys Swarthout, for example? She was an operatic singer in the 1930s,
Yes.
and she was Wilma's a mezzo-soprano, I want to say, though I have no idea what that means, but pretty high voice, maybe, something?
It means mezzo is medium, and soprano is high voice, so it's a medium-high voice.
Pretty high voice, yeah. So she moved her from an unknown to making over $100,000 a year. And $100,000 a year in the Great Depression was serious
significant
money. Yeah, that's
serious
like
money.
being a millionaire, today. So she works at this, and she's just you couldn't put her down. For a long time, she worked for the International Silk Guild, which was controlled by the Japanese. Well, in 1941, guess what the Japanese do to the Silk Guild funding? They pull the plug on it, right? So here's a major client that's gone. She doesn't say, oh, I'm done. It was a nice run. Let me just be Joe's housewife or whatever. She gets gigs in heavy industry, serving as the PR consultant for Evans Products outside of Detroit, and Bud Companies, which made railroad cars in Philadelphia.
Right, and she managed to convince the military to use these gliders, right, or at least to test them out and see if they could use them.
That was Evans Products, yes. And they were a plywood manufacturer, and they get involved in the glider situation, which was used, by the military in the Second World War. Didn't work out all that great, but she was involved in that and with Evans' other products, and she helped Bud sell their railroad cars. Again, she has this fascination with railroads and whatnot. So the war ends, and the founders of both Bud and Evans die. She's got this thing with men dying on her, right? But it helps to drive her career forward, because she could have just fallen into a pattern where she's working for these companies and, eventually ages out and just retires and whatnot. But she's looking for something to do, and BC Forbes comes to her and says, I need an article, and I'd like you to write it about women in American business. This is right at the end of the Second World War, right? So there are a lot of women who are employed during the Second World War, but also a lot of women who started their own businesses. And he wanted a rundown on that, and Wilma gave that to him. But in the process, she also started to check corporate shareholder roles. And what she discovered was that for most of the big companies that she looked at, which were the largest companies in the U.S., a majority of the shareholders were women. Now, they didn't own a majority, yes, which was completely shocking. Yeah. They didn't own a majority of the shares, because there were always a few rich guys who owned huge blocks of shares. But on a straight up basis, as a stockholder, male, female, married, or an institution, females had the majority, and in other places they had the plurality. So they might be 40%. But that's more than any of the other categories. So she publishes this article in December of 1945 in Forbes magazine, and it's a big hit. She's saying all this cash that she's made during the war, which she couldn't spend because of the rationing and whatnot. And she thinks, maybe I should invest in the stock market since all these women are doing this already. She'd kind of given up on the stock market, as many Americans had, after the Great Crash in 1929. And her maternal grandfather, the fellow who worked for Germania/Guardian Life Insurance that I mentioned earlier, had left her a bit of a nest egg, but had left it with a trustee. And the trustee managed to lose essentially all of it during the Great Depression. So she did not want that to happen again. She didn't want to just passively turn her money over to somebody who didn't really have any skin in the game, so to speak, as Warren Buffett would later say, right? Who didn't have an incentive to really grow that for her. So she decided that she was going to invest directly, and she started to do so. And she bought a share in U.S. Steel, which was the largest steel manufacturer in the United States and in the world after the Second World War, and decided to go to a stockholder meeting. And she was absolutely appalled by what she saw in the whole process, because it was in Hoboken, New Jersey, which is this little infamous rat hole over across the Hudson River from New York City, not very easy to get to. And most of the shareholders are in New York City. And ones coming from other parts of the country are going to be going into the transportation hub in New York City, not the Hoboken. So why is it in Hoboken? Yeah. So she shows up, and there's hardly anyone there. And it turns out that annual shareholder meetings in the United States had degraded to essentially perfunctory, pro forma, hour-long ceremonies, essentially. And she didn't like that, because shareholders are the owners, and they should at least know what's going on and at least be able to veto major steps by management that they don't agree with. So,
if I can just pause you here before you continue on, just to kind of, because everything that you're saying has kind of run along with what I was reading from your book. And I just want to make some things kind of, more clear. Just to kind of reiterate what you're saying here is that Wilma was just this kind of ordinary individual. Didn't matter that she was a woman or a man, in a sense, she just was a self-made person. It was significant that she was a woman at the time, of course, but also, like, in reading your book, her attitude wasn't that she should be, given preferential treatment as being a woman. She was really kind of this, person who was advocating for everybody to have the ability to take part in the, she was calling it the share owning process, right? Rather than the shareholding process.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah.
And she picked that up from BC Forbes, who was also of that mind.
Yeah. And there was something I wanted to read as well, just for our audience, because I thought that this was a great quote. And this kind of encapsulates the journey that Wilma has been on so far and will continue to go on, and how it relates to our audience. Because I thought this was quite inspirational. So BC Forbes at this time, they were kind of sinking in comparison to their competitors, I guess, before Wilma came on and wrote this article, it sounds like. And so, but he had this kind of motto that he went by and that he wrote in his book, Keys to Success. And I think this is a great quote. I almost want to frame it. So he says, "Your success depends upon you. Your happiness depends upon you. You have to steer your own course. You have to shape your own future. You must educate yourself. You have to do your own thinking." And then he says, "The men who have done big things are those who are not afraid to attempt big things, who are not afraid to risk failure to gain success."
Yeah, and that's exactly what Wilma was doing. She was step by step building a whole new career for the second half of her life, because she's part of, I guess, what's come to be called the greatest generation. And it doesn't mean that every member of that generation was great, but there are a number of very remarkable people that came out of that early 20th century, and it's because they have this very mindset that BC just talked about. So yeah, that's a great quotation, and it encapsulates Wilma and this learning process that she's going through, because it's not something you're going to learn in a textbook, right? It's lived experience, and then she applies what she knows about the world and decides that there's something rotten in corporate America and that she's going to change it. So she goes to an annual meeting and she says, "We need to have qualified women on the board. It's not going to tank a corporation to have a woman on the board if she's qualified." And they politely applauded her because she had the bravery to stand up and say something at the corporate meeting, but they didn't listen to her. So she upped the ante and showed up in 1890s garb, a hand-me-down dress from her mother, at a U.S. Steel meeting. And, so she sticks out like a sore thumb. I mean, this would...
A wool dress.
Yeah, a long dress and stuff I've never heard of before, lorgnettes and bags and hats, and just quite the spectacle. But she knew, because she had been in the PR game and had been a journalist, that she was going to attract journalists. And these corporate meetings weren't all that widely covered back then, but U.S. Steel was big enough. There were a couple of reporters there who reported this out. Somebody took a picture of her, and it went out on the AP Wire, which is the equivalent of having a viral YouTube video today. So she was almost instantly famous, and she started buying stocks in other corporations, showing up at their annual meetings.
So basically, Wilma, she said, I have to use this opportunity as a shareholder to be able to have my voice heard, rather than the thinking that we have all these annual meetings in these kind of hidden, kind of gunky places where nobody cares to show up. We need to actually get involved, because we partially own this company. And so she was kind of, and this is how often companies and corporations would market their products so that people would want to purchase it, right? They would say, you would be a part owner, like you will be, this is part of the American dream in a sense, like you'll own part of U.S. Steel. And so then when she actually shows up, it's like, well, that's just kind of what they're saying, but that's not how they're actually behaving, right?
Correct. Yes. And because she's part of this greatest generation, she's not looking just to virtue signal. Right, not that there was a Twitter back then or anything, but she's not looking just to write an op-ed and be done with it. She thinks that this needs to be changed in order to save the United States of America from the Soviet Union and communism.
Yes.
Because while all this is going on, the Cold War is gearing up. And she's wondering, why should Americans not support communism? Right? The mass of the poorest people. Why not join this thing where they claim they're going to take care of you? Well, their corporations can take care of Americans as well. You buy shares in the corporation, and then it pays dividends, and you use the dividends to buy the things you need. And so, but she started to run into these barriers where these corporate directors, the chairman of the board, and also the C-suite executives are not really paying attention to stockholder needs. So she shows up with a couple of other corporate activists, and they're derided as gadflies, as just these pesky little things, that bother us, but they were making key points. Why is it that they hold annual meetings in Hoboken and in Flemington? Right? Who's heard of Flemington? Even a lot of people from New Jersey haven't heard of Flemington. It's just it was a rail stop, and it was very inconvenient. So why are these meetings just perfunctory? So she started showing up in these costumes that got her the publicity that she needed to help to grow her nonprofit organization, which was a financial literacy organization trying to explain to people how and why to invest in the stock market and what to look out for, because they were not getting that sort of information in government schools at the time, and they don't today either. And she is trying to get reforms, and it happens quite quickly. By the mid-1950s, she's a household name in America. There's a Broadway play about her, turned into a movie called Solid Gold Cadillac, and the reforms that she's pushing are coming through. There are some qualified women who are being appointed to corporate boards. Corporations start to have their annual meetings in major cities and to rotate them. They start to have things like lunch served so that people don't want to just wrap up the meeting and go off to lunch, so that there could be some time for discussion and debate. And she would show up in these costumes, but she also show up with a stack of research materials and Robert's Rules of Order. And she would make or try to make the corporate executives to follow Robert's rules. And there was a bunch of discussions in the law review literature about whether they actually had to follow Robert's rules or not, and so forth. But she was so.
Wait, what are Robert's rules? Can you explain that?
Robert's Rules of Orders are the old parliamentary rules about how a meeting is supposed to be run and who gets to speak and on what topics and in what order. It's the Bible of how to hold a meeting that is I don't want to say democratic, but that is fair to all of the participants. And a lot of board chairmen didn't follow Robert's rules. They wanted to follow their own autocratic rules, and Wilma and the other gadflies were there to stand up, literally stand up at the meetings and to try to bring some order to them. And some of the executives did not like that because they're not used to being told what they should do. They're used to being the ones giving orders. But as Wilma and the other gadflies would point out, they're just employees of the share owners. And this one day of the year, they need to listen to what the share owners have to say in an orderly manner. So a lot of times at that point, they cut her mic.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and that gets important as these more and more people start getting on the Wilma Soss bandwagon and start showing up at corporate meetings, right? So she can only be heard by the couple of people around her. So she starts to bring a megaphone. And when they cut her mic, she just pulls a megaphone out and starts talking into the megaphone.
So great.
Well, then they have Pinkerton guards, a private security force, that would escort her out. So she responds to that by hiring a very large, very intimidating female bodyguard. Wow. To protect her from the Pinkertons as she's talking into the megaphone. It
sounds like Game of Thrones. It's like Game of Thrones here.
That is very interesting. I wish that we had had this conversation before because I would love to, maybe for the movie version, do it as a game of microphones.
Yeah.
Who can gain access to that and be heard. But her costumes were always related to her critique. They weren't just random attention getters. So when there were all these game show scandals in the U.S. in the late 1950s on all the major networks where they were feeding the right answers to preferred contestants and whatnot, and this came out and it was a big to-do. She shows up at the NBC and CBS annual meetings dressed as a cleaning woman with a mop and a bucket because she's going to clean up. Right? Her 1890s garb that she wore to the U.S. Steel meeting and a couple others later on, well, why are you wearing that? Well, to match the thinking of the board of directors of U.S. Steel.
Outdated.
I mean, it was outdated, antiquated, yes. She's a very smart woman. And she claimed she wasn't very good at math, but she knew her accounting inside and out. And when some corporations started to put the bad news into footnotes and like four-point font, she went dressed as Sherlock Holmes with an oversized magnifying glass. And would say, this is so I can see the footnotes where the real story is. And then she'd go on to explain how they were using accounting legerdemain to fool investors. So she was very sharp. And you can imagine how these men felt about this woman showing up and giving them the what for and critiquing them basically.
Yeah, especially in those times, right? Like that was something that was quite unheard of. Now, in your book, Wilma Soss, she comes across as somebody to me when I'm reading it who's quite heroic. And I think that the reasons for that is like all of these things that you're describing here, the ideas that were behind that for her really were not about kind of like, the modern day Wall Street movements where they are kind of commie. It's something that's really different. Here, it's that she wasn't against management and she wasn't against capitalism. She was pro-capitalism. She was pro-free markets. She was pro, I guess, involvement, right? Of people getting involved in their own finances and in educating people about economic freedom. So it was really, really different. So like when you're describing all of this here, that's what makes it heroic. It's not that she was there to fight the man, the capitalist. She was a capitalist. She was part of it. And I guess she wanted to show people that if they were share owners or shareholders, that they could be part of it too. And because they were part of it, they also had a voice and they would be able to express what they thought would be better directions for some of these companies and these corporations. Is that pretty much summing it up?
It is. In fact, on the letterhead of her nonprofit organization, they often included the tagline, "We're not anti-labor or anti-management. We are pro-share owner."
Yeah. And so can we actually zoom out just a little bit from her story and talk a little bit about the historical context then of having the Cold War going on, of having the Soviet Union, communism on this side, fascism has just been kind of battened down. And now this is post-World War II. But you have this threat of communism and you have this clash of ideologies that is still there. This, it's just another form of collectivism. The fascists, they're tucked away for now. But basically, this is still ongoing. And so what did that look like for Americans at that time and for the world? What was the sentiment there?
Well, I mean, it's a titanic struggle, right? And it's not like the U.S. Civil War where you knew who the slaveholders were and who the abolitionists were and so forth. You don't know who the communists necessarily are or how they're working, and that's what led to McCarthyism. But Wilma was not into that. She didn't want to use the state to try to suppress communists in the U.S. She just wanted to show people that capitalism, for lack of a better term, free market enterprise, economic freedom, as you so wonderfully put it, is great and is the thing. So we should focus on that. And then people will see for themselves that it's better to have a smaller slice of a much bigger capitalist pie than an equal slice of a pathetic little communist pie.
And an infinite pie, right? Like that's also like part of the free market argument, right? Is that pie is infinite. You can keep growing. You can keep increasing the pie. Yes. It's not just like, okay, well, we have this finite pie. And that's, usually how people who want to slice up the pie in the communist fashion or the socialist fashion, they see that pie as like, it can't grow anymore. So we need our fair share. And just a little side note about fair share. I was thinking about FDR, who said, we need our fair share, 1933. The New Deal. Then you have Wilma Soss, who was kind of a counteracting force to that as well. And I'm bringing this up because Joe Biden now is using the same kind of verbiage as FDR, and he's been compared to FDR, and he talks a little bit about fair share and things like that, and then there's the Inflation Reduction Act. All of these things, are happening kind of in parallel with perhaps what we saw back then. Like, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I'm writing a book right now about the New Deal. I'm thinking about calling it The First Great Reset.
Oh, wow.
And there are a lot of similarities between Biden and FDR because they're both autocrats who have no idea how the economy functions, too wealthy to really understand how common people live. While Wilma was well-to-do and ended up living in a very, nice neighborhood in New York City in a nice apartment and so on and so forth, she was not uber wealthy by any stretch of the imagination because, as you pointed out earlier, she is a self-made person. She does not come from a vast amount of wealth. Her maternal grandfather was not the president of Germania, right? He was just a regular schlub, making a decent salary, but not getting rich by any stretch of the imagination. So Wilma understood things like inflation in ways that normal Americans did. And so when she had a NBC News radio show called Pocketbook News that was nationally syndicated, ran from 1957 until 1980.
But the news that Thomas Watson Jr., former chairman of International Business Machines, is being named ambassador to the Soviet Union set off a controversy. It's a political appointment instead of a career diplomat who can speak Russian, but it may well please the Russians. I happen to have been on the receiving side of Mr. Watson's mercurial temperament on 2 occasions, once in Texas and once in Toronto at annual meetings years apart. Chairman Watson did not wish to answer a woman stockholder's polite but persistent questioning. He ordered armed guards to drag her out and afterward called her a dedicated person and invited her to lunch. On the second occasion, he put her floor nominee later on the board of IBM. She was Patricia Harris, now a member of the cabinet. As a result, I wear a large white button which says, "Stockholders have civil rights too." This is Wilma Soss, spelled S-O-S-S. My pre-recorded views, as usual, are my own and not necessarily those of the National Broadcasting Company.
You have just heard Wilma Says with Wilma Soss and her pocketbook edition of the news.
So she was one of the first female financial journalists, broadcast journalists in the U.S. There were plenty in print, but in broadcast, and certainly the only one before her the only one to have a quarter-century long nationally syndicated show. I mean, she had over 1 million viewers on Nielsen, or listeners on the Nielsen ratings, which is a large audience even today, right? If you had a video that got 1 million hits, you'd be well. She had a radio show 10 to 15 minutes long every week that had a million listeners. So she had a corporate sponsorship one year with a big pharma company that I won't name. And she gave up the sponsorship, even though it was a lot of money, because she wanted to retain her journalistic integrity and independence and not even seem like she might be making statements that were in the interest of the pharmaceutical industry rather than her listeners. So she put her listeners first.
Very different than today.
There are some independent journalists still out on like Substack and whatnot, but yeah, for the most part, it's very different from today. Though she was born Republican, she was not a Republican hack. She would call them out when they were doing things that she didn't like. She was very much for the gold standard and the gold dollar. And as we started to slide off the gold dollar in the late 1960s and early 1970s, she was very vocal about it. And when the great inflation hit, she was writing things about like, why don't we get a tax break for this? Inflation is essentially a tax that no legislature enacted, right?
Yes.
So it's unjust. It's taxation without representation. Why not give that back to us in the form of a formal tax break on our tax returns? And of course, that went nowhere. But she did articulate it, and she did articulate the need for the U.S. to remain on the gold dollar. And of course, that didn't happen either. She pushed very hard for secret ballots in corporate elections, because what's the sense of having an election if people know how other people are voting, because then they could be pressured to vote. This is especially the case with management pressuring employees to vote the way management wanted rather than the way the employees might want. Many employees, of course, own shares in the corporations that they work for as part of ESOPs or employer-sponsored stock purchase programs. And so she fought for that. She fought for cumulative voting, where you could take all of your votes and put them all for one candidate instead of having to spread them across a slate. and that would allow minority stockholders, small stockholders like herself and her friends, to maybe get somebody on the board of directors. But a lot of these reforms were rolled back after she passed away. She died in 1986, and she was effectively sort of canceled at that point. Nobody talked about her anymore. She wasn't there, and she had a protege, but the protege was more about herself. Her name was Evelyn Y. Davis. There's a chapter in the book about her later on. But fascinating character in her own right, but not really the sort of liberty lover that Wilma was. Wilma wasn't liberty curious. She knew about the importance of liberty and really pushed for more and more economic freedom and for, free markets, free enterprise, anti-collectivism.
Yeah. So that was the Great Era, as you were saying, right? Is that what it was called, the Great Era?
The great inflation of the 1970s?
No, kind of
the greatest generation.
The greatest generation. Thank you. Sorry.
Yes.
So that, it seems to me like those ideas at that point, in history, they were popular, which is kind of different to what we see now. And I'm sure you've seen this meme that floats around that says, hard times create strong men, which maybe was that generation. And then strong times create comfort, mediocrity, weak men, and then weak men create hard times. And then it goes around and around and around again. So, we seem to be in some hard times, and I think maybe they'll be getting harder. And that's a result of, that cycle going around. So maybe by the time that Wilma died, or when she was near the end of her life, those ideas were already kind of moving out of circulation. When I spoke with Sam Gregg, he wrote about this as well, how in the 90s already they were moving away from profits being the main goal of corporations. And they started using these terms like inclusive, equity, all of these things, like these new words in the lexicon that we hear all the time now, they were already popping up through corporations, but now in popular culture, it's right before us. So maybe this is part of what was happening with Wilma then.
Right. And she would agree with that. She would probably say weak humans rather than men because of her insistence that, of course, is correct that, while perhaps men and women shouldn't be swimming in the same competitive swimming pool, certainly in business, they're complete equals, if not women being better. There are some books coming out about that now. And she sometimes made that argument, but she was happy with just noting, because the prevailing sentiment at the time was you put a female on the corporate board and everyone's going to sell their stocks and the corporation's going to tank. But that did not happen, and there was no rational reason for it to happen so long as the women being put on the boards were qualified. And she made sure of it. And in fact, sometimes they tried to put shill women on boards just to shut her up, and she was having none of it, and she would actually vote against them.
Yeah, so that's really important because nowadays, we say, and we see this with ESGs, which we spoke about in a previous podcast, right? Where they say, for the governance aspect, you need to have a certain amount of this minority, of this ethnicity, of, this gender, whatever it is. And it doesn't matter if they are the most qualified person for the position. All that matters is that kind of virtue signaling role that we say, we'll give this to this person.
Right. Wilma was definitely not for virtue signaling. The second half of her life she devoted to key aspects of improving corporate governance in the United States, and would literally stand up at corporate meetings surrounded by thousands of men and say what she felt was right. Yeah,
that's wonderful. So what do you think that people can draw from this? I really suggest that they go and read your book, Fearless, Wilma Soss and the Forgotten Investors Movement. It's so far, like I said, wonderful. I'm really enjoying the story. So well written and so fun to read. And inspiring. So what do you think that our listeners can take from Wilma's story and apply to their own lives?
Well, she's very inspirational, right? If you want change, you really want change, then go out and do something about it. And that doesn't mean running to the government and whining for some stupid law that's just going to impose cost, right? If you really want to, you need to get involved personally. You need to understand the issues inside and out before you start to try to make policy changes within corporations or within government. Inspirational seems to be the word that comes up in interview after interview. And we are looking at other outlets to get the word out. Of course, we're hoping for a movie to be made about Wilma, another movie, one based more closely on her actual life and that takes her story all the way up to the end. And we're also looking at sort of like Tuttle Twin for juveniles stories to get her name out and her story out to the youngins before they, end up getting sucked into government schools and brainwashed away. And I've been trying to pitch op-eds, and I haven't successfully landed this one yet, but on the notion that reading biographies of people like Wilma is a way to increase financial literacy. It's a way to increase interest in liberty because it's such a compelling story that you're not trying to hook people on esoteric ideas and whatnot, right? You get people interested in her story, and then they're like, "Oh yeah, that does make sense. If you want change, form a nonprofit and go for it. Use moral suasion."
Yeah.
Right? You're not the heavy iron fist of the government to do it.
Yeah, maybe I can do it too, right? Like that's the kind of idea there. And
yes.
Is, you know what, there are things here that I feel inside of me when I read this, right? So you think like it gives you energy. There's like a life force there that we all have. And it's the life force that does combat the kind of ideologies of envy and actually of greed and things, that are about taking from other people. It's that creative life force that says, you know what, I can do it. I don't need to be a victim to my circumstances. Like you were speaking earlier about Wilma, people die. She could have said, okay, I'm just leaving this company or I'm just going to skate along. No, I'm going to take this opportunity. I'm going to do something else with it. Always, doing something new, doing something different and moving forward. And that's real progress, I think.
Yes. Real progress. Yep.
Yeah. Not progressivism.
Yes.
Excellent. Well, Robert, this is wonderful. I think there's many more details in your book that I don't want you to give away everything. I think people should go out and read this book for themselves. Is there anything you'd like to leave our audience with, though, before we end this session today? No, I hope you enjoy the book. Yeah, I think it is. I think it is extremely well written, and I can't take all the credit for that because I do have a co-author named Janice Traflett who was wonderful. She teaches at the Freeman School of Management at Bucknell University. Had a great editor at All Seasons Press who took out some of the more wonky, long-winded things that I just put into this interview. But I think it reads really well. And, of course, the underlying story is just so compelling of a married woman making all of that money and then doing good with it, as much good as she possibly could in her blessed life. Well, that is so wonderful. Let's leave it there, Robert. Thank you so much. And I hope to speak with you again soon on Liberty Curious. I have another book coming out called Liberty Lost, so plan on it. Sounds great. Thank you. Awesome. Thank you so much.